I am Kitara Johnson Jones, and my mom gave me this Swahili name. Her friends were African in college, and Kitara Sadawi means sword proud, and I thought I was going to be a prize fighter, but I left that to my son. He picked up the torch because I didn't. In my day job, I am Chief Human Resource Officer at Excelsior Wellness, and I'm a national speaker and trainer on my own and consultant.
Okay, so we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but before we jump in, tell us whatever you want us to know about your background. You were telling some folks where you're from originally and that whole thing, so however much you're comfortable getting into that, go ahead and share with the rest of the group.
Well, I have an interesting path to leadership and to the space that I'm in today. I grew up in the inner city of Chicago. My mom had 13 kids. Kanisha, Katara, LaShawna, Jamie, Elizabeth, Crystal, James, Naomi, Stephen, Daniel, Tisha, Timothy, and Joseph. Put a good beat on that. You got a rap song. We grew up in extreme poverty on the south side of Chicago. We used to bounce back and forth between upstate New York and Poughkeepsie, New York, and back to Chicago. We did that for quite a few years. I went to a high school called Inglewood High School on the south side of Chicago. There were 620 freshmen that started with me, and only 114 graduated. By my sophomore year, out of the 620 freshmen, I ranked in the top 20 as far as my test scores went. But there were gangs that chased you home every day, and I was born with a heart murmur, and so I wasn't supposed to run, but I figured if they're gonna chase me every day, I might as well join the track team. And I did, and I won MVP of the track team. And at first I did everything not to join, to try to stay late after school so I wouldn't get chased. So I was in junior engineers training, the college preparatory math program, the band, the art club, I mean, student government, you name it. I did all of those things, even the horticulture club. I didn't know what was going on in there, but I was like, the flowers are pretty. But I went through all of that, and then I went on to joined the Army after high school, but out of 620 freshmen, only 114 graduated. The gang members, in order to be safe to go to school, I was forced to join, and they broke my hand with a bat, and I was stabbed with my artery severed. I had to learn to write with my left hand, and I went to college. I used to say it was by accident. But it wasn't by accident. It was divine order. I was supposed to go to college. I didn't do well at first. It was a hard adjustment being a former gang leader, and I just wasn't in a gang. I was a leader in the gang. Because my mother told me, if you're a C student, be the best C student. If you're a street sweeper, be the best street sweeper. But whatever it is, be your best. So I was like, well, I'm here. Might as well lead. And so, went through all of that trauma, and when your values and what your environment tell you don't align, it's kind of hard because you know who you are. I ended up somehow in college. I was the only gang member that was actually going to school every day. I loved school, and I had really good teachers who believed in me, and they would tell me that you're better than this situation. And you think about walking over coagulated pools of blood just to get to middle school. Mm-hmm. And this is in the United States. And out of the 620 freshmen, we had like 40 textbooks for each class. So we weren't even allowed to bring our books home because the other periods and other classes needed those books. So, but this was my experience, in America. Mm-hmm. And you wouldn't think that this is the way that kids actually have to grow up and learn. And the parks they weren't just parks. You had hypodermic needles. You had, the park was where you go to get killed. And we didn't have swimming. So a lot of the connections that a lot of professionals that I work with now have when they talk about their childhood, I often feel isolated because my stories, what do you say, talk about one of your friends that died, from gang activity in a C-suite. that's not typically, the stories that align. So you feel a little ostracized from that. And
It's so funny you say that, and I hate to cut you off and interrupt, but I grew up in north of here in Chewelah, really poverty-stricken, like really poor. I tell stories all the time. I went to a birthday party once in like 6th grade. It was on the side of a mountain, and this family was living in a school bus that they had converted into a home with like sticks that they had used and made tarps and made like a little mudroom, and they used rainwater collection, dirt floor, all this stuff. But it's not that different than what you're talking about in terms of extreme poverty and the things you have to go through and the adversity. It's just a different version of it. And it's funny to me that the people in that room can't look in their background, and maybe they're just extremely privileged, but can't look somewhere in their background and at least find some kind of a common thread to that. And I'm not saying it's the same. It was way different. Yours is so much more, intense. But the poverty thing is a theme that is very consistent in a lot of parts of America. So I find it really difficult that they can't find empathy, at least on some level. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it depends. Like the relationships. I'm blessed to work in my day job in a place where I can align with some who had experience with poverty, but sometimes not everyone has had such a similar experience.
Yeah.
And it's not to be a pathway to exotic, for someone, but, definitely sharing so that we keep in perspective the people that we serve on a daily basis and understanding that everyone's experience is different. But I'm grateful to have not giving up after I dropped out, going back. And some teachers believed, some didn't, but it's amazing what can happen when people in a community tell you that they believe in you. I remember it was the guy from the fruit stand, it was the bus driver who said, "I remember you." And the bus driver, actually, the CTA bus driver, let me live with him in a better community so that I could go to college, and actually drove me out to college. And and after that, joined the Army, 5.5 years. And after that, I served in Germany, and then came back to the United States. And I'm a 90% service-connected disabled veteran, and a mother of 5. And I have a 28-year-old that's in the UFC. I've got a 22-year-old that's in Army Aviation. He just got accepted to Warrant Officer School. I have a 21-year-old that is an executive assistant to 3 Microsoft executives, and I have an 18-year-old that just finished Running Start and has his associates, just graduated high school and starting on the path to become a nurse. And then I have a 10-year-old daughter.
Wow.
Going on 25.
Aren't they all? All right, so before we dig in, we talked about this ahead of time, but I think it's important for us to put some definitions behind some of the terms we're talking about today so that we're all, at least for this conversation, speaking the same language. And this is where I'll remind you, you're all welcome to try to get my attention somehow if you need to message me on LinkedIn so I see it, or throw something at me, but we do want this to be a conversation. It's what Business Brew is designed to be. But let's talk about the definition of diversity first and what that means so we're all using that common language.
When I'm talking about diversity this morning, it's mainly related to the workplace. Okay. Most of my master's is in organizational leadership and management. My bachelor's is in workforce education and development. And I have a certificate from Cornell in diversity and inclusion for HR. And when I speak about diversity, I think of it in terms of the workplace, and it happens in its broadest sense. So not just, oftentimes people look at diversity and they say, oh, it's racial and ethnic diversity. I look at it in a form of cognitive diversity, also personalities, the differing abilities, and the numerous identities that people have. And I look at it in that respect, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And we know when we look up who's a protected class, I have a little thing that I use as my barometer. If anybody looks up who is considered a protected class, does anybody know? Without Google?
Who's considered a protected?
Yes, who's considered a protected class?
Within organizations?
Within the workplace, yeah.
LGBTQ+. women, people with of handicap, disability, older people as well. I don't.
So when we think about that, often, oh, did you have your hand? You're about to.
I think religion, familial, gender, I don't know.
So are we talking to, so the answers that are coming in, I would just want to relay this to the LinkedIn group, are LGBTQ+, so, your sexual identity is protected. Are we talking about protected? That's what I was trying to get at. Are we talking about protected in the legal sense? Or are we talking about?
So, yeah, and oftentimes people consider it related to race, but specific races. But they don't look at that, it says race period. It doesn't say which race. Every group is a protected class, every race. And although we know that race is a social construct and race doesn't truly exist, but racism does. There is a stratification of access when it comes to the color or how lighter or darker your skin is. It's shown in all the studies. So I look at every employee, every person that comes to the door as a protected class. And I think that's how every leader should address it. Because we often look at what type of language should I use for this group, or what type of language. Languages are going to always change. And that's why you're going to see a lot of shifting, not just chief diversity officers now, you have chief people officers, because they have to look at it in this broader sense of people operations. In the past, the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging was a separate but equal value. But now we realize it's a part of everything that we do, so why are we separating it? It should be a slide in every PowerPoint. It should be, in every part of our conversation. Because when we think about diversity in its broadest sense, we are looking at who's at the table. So, yeah.
Okay, so I think we have a general understanding of diversity, because you said it goes beyond racial and ethnic. It's cognitive, it's personality type, it's anything that, it's a group of different people. We're not all just the same, right?
Right.
So what's inclusion then? Let's get that definition going.
When I talk about inclusion, that is related to how people are able to come to the table as their authentic selves without assimilation. For example, you see me today with long straight hair, but I truly have short hair, kind of like Alan's. But it grew out and I haven't colored it, so I need to fix it. So right now it's in between this spotted leopard look. So I was like, I'm not gonna do that today. I call these hats. But oftentimes when I come into the workplace, when I look at the C-suite or executives in organizations, you don't see a lot of people with super short hair. There's a look. We all know it. It's the look that you have. It's hair right here. It's the pearls. It's the, for women at certain levels, we have artifacts that show us what leadership is, and it changes how we perceive people. So are braids professional? Absolutely. Are we looking at people in Fortune 500 companies and magazines who are executives that have braids? Not so much. Mm-hmm. It's starting to trickle in there, but not so much. And it's the biases that we typically have based off of our experiences. So when I think about inclusion, it's how are we making space to make sure that your workplace and your organization is just like community. And community is the place where everyone belongs, right? So what are we doing to make sure that everyone feels like they belong?
I have so many questions.
So it's kind of like your make space. It's not just making the space, because sometimes as leaders we have to keep that space open. Think about two large pieces of whatever. It was a boat and it's in the water, icebergs that come together, they separate a little bit, and you get some melting you could go through, and then it comes back together. When you have people who come from different places and they come into your workplace and you say, you have an initiative, we want to bring in more young professionals, and we say little things like, we need some young people in here, they're this good with technology, we need some fresh ideas. As if people who've already been there did not have fresh ideas. So we don't think about how we're being inclusive, including those who have been there for their tenure, all of that, it matters.
Any questions? Because I have one. I have so many. I'm assuming, I don't know how to say this without saying the word more than once. There's some assumptions we're making when we're making a space for everyone to be their authentic self. We're making an assumption that people aren't just going to be buttholes, right? Like they're not just going to come in and be awful. You still have to have respect for others, right? Like you can't, my authentic self is to be a jerk or a bigot, right? Like
Right.
we can't do that, right? So how as a leader do you set the space saying you can come and be your whole self, but we have to be mindful of the other people. We have to be respectful. How do you manage that tension?
My favorite is yes and. If you say yes but, that negates anything that you said positive prior to that. So yes and. Leaders are the ones who create the culture in your organization. What are the values? When I have meetings, the first thing I do is start with norms, whether it's a training or a meeting. I say, how many people here? You know, we have everyone who came here. We have norms to be judgment-free, to be solutions-focused, to handle conflict with civility, to trust that each other's intentions are good. No one came from wherever they live all the way to this meeting to intentionally insult you. The other piece is to respect the cultural lens, because words are not universal. We think about, like, for example, the word grill. Grill could be how you interrogate someone, asking numerous questions in a row. Grill could be the front of a pickup truck. Grill could be what you barbecue on. Grill could be what some young people will call your teeth. You know, grill could be. I mean, we can go on, and it's just one word. So can you imagine the lens from being from the southern part of the United States, the East Coast, the West Coast, Central, you know, in America. It's just, you know, or being from another country. So when we think about that, it's how the leaders set the culture. What are the values? I know that in some organizations you will have, you know, respect, but we have to look at it. What does the respect mean? So you have to define that as a leader and as a leadership team. I like adding into your values that it's okay to make a mistake, because oftentimes, because of our lens of hurt, we have people with varying levels of trauma in their life, from racism, from by gender, trauma from what a parent or a provider said to them, the experience of their parents and their partners. So when we think about that, when we come in a workplace, we have to assume that everyone has had some exposure to trauma in some type of way. And people bring that into the workplace. So every trauma or those negative experiences, when we don't feel them in a moment, they become like rocks in your shoes. That's what my therapist told me. She said, it's like rocks in your shoes. And so when people push you, everything you say comes from a place of pain until you deal with those particular things. So when you come in together and you set common space on what's important, when you say the norms, and when you keep people together, that shows, and you model that as a leader, that is when you'll see the culture. So that doesn't align with our values. Yes, and you can come as your authentic self, but in the workplace, we also have respect for all members on our team. What does respect look like? Well, if you said being a jerk, well, it's also from your lens, but when we communicate with others, I like to, what I share in our organization is communicate everything you say in 3 different ways. 3 different ways, because the words, again, are not universal. So face-to-face, email. Everybody doesn't take the formal register and put something with a graphic in it. Does that make sense? Because it hits as many learning styles as possible so people can retain that information. And when we look at people who may speak a different language or at birth, you think about, I have to read your message in English. I have to translate it to my native tongue, and then I have it in my brain, and now I have to formulate an answer in my native tongue, and then translate that to English, and then write the response. And then someone that says, well, they're writing and they missed a period and a comma, and discredit the entire email. You know, what does it look like? How do we model giving space for people to show up? And oftentimes when we have issues with employees, it's usually, if you look at the top 10 issues where employees are coming in, I love some of the work of, how many people heard of safety, mattering, and belonging? Safety is psychological safety. What are we doing to make people in our organization feel safe when they come to a meeting? One thing I learned, my CEO is a behavioral psychologist, and so he taught me, like, we put the names of every employee that's at this particular meeting on the agenda at the top, and so you can tick off who had an opportunity to speak and who did not. That way, if there's people who identify as women or LGBTQIA2S+, or if it's, people people of color, we're making sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak. And the other component is everybody doesn't process in 45 minutes, and we have this bias that the person who's speaking the most is the smartest in the room, but we find out the people who have been the most quiet, we're actually taking things in and can retain what was said after the meeting. But as a leader, are we offering other opportunities to follow up after a meeting for those who don't speak, like public speaking? So do we do an email? So that's what it boils down to. How are we making psychological safety so people feel like they also matter? How do we support mattering in an organization? Your work matters, so I'm not going to let anybody take credit for your work. I'm going to acknowledge you for your contributions. I'm going to acknowledge your team, but I'm also going to acknowledge when you come up with an idea yourself. The other part of mattering is if, for example, perceptions are people's reality. You have some people who are from individualistic culture. Individualistic culture is, I'm an achiever, I did this work, I want credit for my work. And then you have, and you like being by yourself, you're a little more competitive. You want to move really quickly. And then you have some individuals that are from collectivist culture. Oftentimes people who grew up, not everyone, but some individuals that grew up in poverty. Some individuals who grow up, a lot of people of color come from a collectivist culture. What does that mean? Well, the team gets credit. We don't move on unless everybody has had, it doesn't mean that we're going to follow everything, every contribution you give, but it's more of a collectivist idea, is that we're going to build consensus first. It slows things down, which frustrates a lot of people from individualistic culture, which that is also part of diversity. But we tend to say, these people, oh my goodness, they move too slow, they don't get things done, I like things done this way. And so those who have individualistic culture are, moving that way. However, some of those who reflect a little bit longer can find some issues that you can address before it becomes an issue. Just by, it's a balance of understanding where people come from. And that's mattering, allowing people to show up and be a part of the conversation in numerous ways and getting that credit for your work. And the last piece is belonging. How do we make sure that everyone feels as if they belong? It doesn't mean that your culture dominates anybody else's culture when it comes to belonging. What belonging looks like is when I come inside of an organization, I'm at the meeting, and when people cut me off, you as the facilitator say, you open back up that space. Excuse me. Bill was talking, or Amy was talking. You're making sure that people, when they come in and they share their experiences with you, you don't negate that experience. Does that make sense? So it's finding those safety, mattering, and belonging. And it's also like when you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What do people need? They need to feel safe. In order to be able to accept others, you have to have a way of coming to the table without being, super judged about it. It is a balance. So yes, your culture is set by the leadership. Your values are either already set in your organization, or you work with your team to create what those values are and how you're going to show up. And then we hold each other accountable to them. Oftentimes people say, well, we need to discipline, with a different version of that discipline when it comes to punishment. When people punish because they said this, instead of discipline meaning to teach, not to punish. What are the teaching and learning moments that you're creating in your organization? And sometimes understanding where people come from. It's okay to feel what you're feeling. It's not okay to call people out on our team. We call people in. Oftentimes when people are hurt people, heal people. So if someone says something that's considered a microaggression for me as a woman of color, and I say, you don't get to say that. Does that make sense? And I'm angry. I can see that the person, if they raise their voice, if they're, getting emotional, that person has had some experiences before. And I can say, that's not me, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I hurt you. That's not admitting that you did anything wrong, that's acknowledging the hurt. Does that make sense? And say, I don't mind having a conversation, but I'm not sure if this venue is the correct time to have it. Can we have a conversation at a mutual time that's beneficial for both of us? And actually follow up and have that conversation and be willing to make changes. And it comes from that authentic space of saying, I don't know. I didn't know that meant something to you. And not assuming that what you said to this one person is offensive to another person. And I think what leaders are gonna start realizing they have to do is build relationships with people on your team. So it's not about knowing all the right words. Oh, sorry.
No, you're great. I'm so glad you brought that up. That's actually one of the few questions I had ahead of time, because you mentioned it when we talked earlier about, you said it's not about, if your goal is to not say the wrong word or to just not get in trouble, you're really not doing this in a serious way. You're just trying to walk through a minefield. Instead, you said it's all about relationships. I'm glad, I just got excited when you brought that up because I don't have to ask it now.
Yeah, it's about relationships. When you get to know, truly know the members of your team. For example, we as leaders, you'll do an evaluation for your employees, right? Have you done that? Have you met with every employee for at least 15 minutes and let them know exactly what success looks like in their role and what you expect? Well, if you haven't done that for every person, if a person is older, they're going to feel that you gave bias to those that were young. If a person is a person of color, they're going to feel like you gave biases in favor to someone else. So when you do the same thing, you don't have to do it the same way, but meet with each person on your team and define what success looks like. Does that make sense? Because when you do that, now the brain has to make sense of why you're rejected. Does that make sense? So we are hardwired to connect. People all are. We're born that way. Hardwired to connect. And research shows that when you feel excluded or you're left out, you feel it lights up the same area of the brain as physical pain. Research shows that it even happens that way from strangers. For example, I walk down the hallway of the building and I see a stranger and I say, hey, how you doing? And they walk off. 9 o'clock is like, wait a minute. Did they see me? I know they saw it. You play it back in your head. Then you get to the office. How are you doing today? I'm good. But I was walking this morning and I know I waved at this person. And some people are just so rude. Some of us then go to social media, put up our little post or meme about people not acknowledging people, regardless of where you are. Don't forget that you're people, the ones the memes that we see. And then you have your lunch, you talk to your coworkers. Sometimes you get home and at the end of the day, it's like, man, it was a good day. Your kids, your partner or spouse comes up, you're like, today was a good day, but I was walking down the... So it can happen even from a stranger. So imagine what happens in a workplace when you work with people every day and you're excluded from a meeting or you're left out from an email. Over time, it adds up. So what does the brain do? They. When you start using pronouns and you hear your employees using pronouns, you have to think, what do they need? Do they need safety? Do they need mattering? Or do they need belonging? We need to hire more people of color in here. I mean, no one is listening to the experiences of people who are different. What does that person need? They need belonging. They're not feeling like they've been included in some of the conversations or the activities that you're doing off-site or whatever. When you think about people talking about leaving or, I know that I could be accepted somewhere else and, I brought these skills. Well, I tried to give this to the team. What does that person need? They need mattering. That means that we need to reach out and see what do they need to be acknowledged. Some people just want to be acknowledged, like, oh, thank you. We love that idea that you gave. And then they can kind of be quiet a little bit, in the meetings because we have people who do dominate in that way. The other, I want to give an example of, when COVID started, I noticed that in a scenario, there was all of the Hollywood squares, I call it, on Zoom. And a woman was trying to give a presentation. So I observe My boss and I, we have this thing, we call it noticing. So it's important as leaders to do noticing. So we're watching, and the female is speaking. And the men are like this. Looking all up. Some people are, look, click. You can tell when people aren't paying attention, you know. Some people got really clever. They just got the picture of them looking intently. But after this, I noticed, I said, well, this is so disrespectful. And I do this work. So disrespectful. So I'm doing my noticing, right? And I'm writing down what I noticed. Afterwards, I go to the leader and I say, what did you observe in this meeting? I noticed that when this female employee was speaking, the male seemed very disinterested. Based off of what? My lens and my perception, right? Mm-hmm. Brilliant way that how this was handled. So we decide, call that person in. But look how this was handled. Great leadership. They said, hey, how do you think the meeting went today? That person the female employee begins to share how she felt the meeting went, what she needed. Not sure of herself if she did it right because it seems like other people were preoccupied. The word then was from the leader was to tell the person, the next time they're in a meeting, I want you to feel empowered to pause the meeting. Ask your team if anyone it seems as if a lot of people have some pressing concerns. How about I give you 5 minutes to wrap up your concerns and come back because I really would like some feedback from you. The leader went on to tell the person that they could trust their team. That after you do that, they're gonna come back with all their attention. Did you notice what didn't happen? These men in this organization are not paying attention. You know, this chauvinism that's here. And then I was looking at research because I forgot, I was so focused on the traditional areas of diversity that I forgot about gender communication. Men typically, when they're paying attention the most, lean back in the chair, look up to the side, look off because they're really paying attention. And it reminded me, I was like, wait a minute, when my husband's listening to a podcast, he's usually in a chair, he's kind of leaned back and looking towards the wall. But because of the lens of women often being ignored or spoken over or completely dismissed, that was the lens in which I watched those interactions. And that's not saying that those things don't exist. I'm not saying that they don't exist because there are biases. People all have them. We all have them in some way. And so notice that the leader never said, don't trust your team, didn't call any member on the team anything, didn't even put the negative thought in that person's head. They said, how did you experience the meeting? Because sometimes the things we see may not even be things that others see, if that makes sense. So let's not make an issue when it isn't.
And I'm thinking about too, so that's an online version and how you manage that, but interpersonal, like one-on-one, if there's something that's influenced me, trauma, whatever, where making direct eye contact is difficult, you might interpret that as I'm avoiding you, I don't like you, whatever, or I have a problem with you, but really it's just a trauma-informed response. I'm just behaving out of that. So not taking that assumption that I was being rude or I don't like women or I don't like people of color, you can address the situation differently than just jumping to that conclusion.
And we all have work to do in that. And that's why it's important, again, to build relationships, because I'll know what hurts you. I'll know, and when I build relationships, if I misspeak in any way, I've built a relationship strong enough that I can make a withdrawal. Does that make sense? But if I have no relationship, I have nothing to draw from. Does that make sense? So then you get this cancellation, and we can't learn from psychological safety. So I tell people, we can't just absolute, like for example, I can't call you a racist because you used a microaggression. Right. I have to take in consideration, where do you come from? Where did you live? Where did you grow up? when the words changed, did anyone update the whole world on the woke dictionary? And if there is a woke dictionary, where is it? I'm serious. No. Where do you find out what words are appropriate and inappropriate?
Somebody sent me a list because I was being mindful in a meeting and I went, oh, I probably shouldn't say that. And I just caught myself saying something, not about the wrong thing, but just knowing that's a term that might offend somebody. And she's like, oh, you'll love this list. And she sent me this list of all these terms that you're not, and it's everything. It's everything. And that's not a place to operate from either, right? Like just being, like you said, if all I'm concerned about is saying the right thing and not getting in trouble, I'm never going to say anything.
And we all do it. I watched it online. It was white silence equals violence. White people should stand up and say something. Then I'll see a white person say something. They'll say, not like that. And I'm like, whoa. We all have to come assuming positive intent. And we also have to be in a place that we are looking at our multicultural environment after work. Where are we getting our sources from? Are we listening to only people who agree with us, or are we looking at both sides? Because when you come into a workplace, today's workforce, you don't know who people are. You say something thinking that you know one person, you don't know their partner, their spouse, or anything. So it's important not to be afraid, or be open and willing to learn and growth. Growth is uncomfortable because growth hurts sometimes.
Well, and I think that's the key, right? So if I say something like, one that I catch myself wanting to say all the time is, the bottom of the totem pole or something like that. And that for Indigenous peoples could be, because is the bottom of the totem pole actually the bad place to be? I don't know. But being willing to be coachable in that moment, if somebody says, hey, you said that, and just so you know, this is what that means to me, if there's that relationship there, neither of us get upset, and we both learn. Like I learned from that's not, it's not about avoiding minefields, it's about being teachable in that moment.
Even pronouns. I remember for me, I was like, the pronouns, I don't feel like I should put pronouns on, I didn't want to use the pronouns on my signature block because I felt that there was nothing I couldn't do regarding when it came to gender. I felt like if it's something I really want to do, I'm going to be able to do that thing, or I'm definitely going to try, right? And I don't want to be limited by somebody else's social construct of what a woman should be or how a woman should act. And I remember speaking with a coworker. Now I do this work. I'm known nationally for it, top 100, not because I know everything. It's the practical approach and the willingness to speak truth, but also the willingness to look at how do you operationalize this? Most of the conversations are done for interpersonal, but not organizationally. How do you address these things? And it's I forgot where I was going with this.
It's okay.
Was it the vocabulary? What was I saying? I don't know how I just did that. But,
pronouns.
The pronouns.
There it was. Okay.
So thank you so much. So one of the people that was on my team said, Kitara, you don't use pronouns for you. You use pronouns for people like me who identify as they. And she said, when I see your signature block, I know that you are aware that people like me exist. I was like, wow, that was so profound, so profound. So sometimes when we're coming in, it's not, I'm losing my freedom of speech. It's not about losing freedom of speech. It's making sure that we are ensuring that people can show up to work and bring their best. We want employees that can come in and team members that can come in and be their best, but that's not gonna happen if they're afraid to speak, if they're afraid to send an email, if they're afraid to say the wrong thing. But when we create opportunities for people to get along, and we do have some type of accountability for when these things don't happen, does that make sense? What does this teaching and learning moment look like? How can I coach you up? What else do you need? Now, when something becomes a behavior pattern where people don't change, that's when a leader needs to come in and say, what are the next steps for this person? Because you are not aligned, your language isn't aligned with our values of inclusivity. This has been brought to you in numerous different ways, and you've acknowledged it. You said yes, you shook your head, but your behaviors are not aligned with this. So are you willing as a leader to have those tough conversations? But so many people are afraid of conflict that they avoid it. Well, I don't want to talk. Oh, let's not, we're just gonna, oh, we could come back to me later. And it's like, no, right now, when it comes to diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging, we need to start at a place where organizations are doing conflict resolution training. Conflict resolution training. For some reason, we've learned to not talk about things that make us uncomfortable. So we skip over it, we get busier, we get a longer agenda, we end up projects. The other thing that you need is communication training. Team building. Those are the things that we need to really focus on. Now, when it comes to diversity, inclusion, you have numerous best practices out there, but some best practices don't work in your organization. And it starts by asking simple questions when you're doing business meetings. Who's missing from the table? Whose voice is missing? Who else do we need to make a solid decision? If you're doing a community impact, whose voices, and you come up with this great idea on your team, have you done the research of seeing, who's missing? Who's my target market? People say, well, there's not a lot of racial and ethnic diversity here, but you have cognitive diversity. Are you aligned with people? They don't, and I really don't like cultural fit, because when we say you have to be a cultural fit, it means that everybody that comes in this door has to act like this, has to talk like this, and you're gonna lose a lot of innovative ideas, because some of the best, it's gonna cause some conflict. And conflict, there's nothing bad with conflict, long as you handle it with civility. Long as you come with that and okay if we don't all agree. You know what, these are great ideas. We're not gonna take your idea this time, we're gonna go with this idea. But it doesn't mean that your idea is bad. We're gonna take that idea, we're gonna table it over here, because we might need that in the future. It's not what you say, it's how you say it.
Yeah, go ahead. Fire. You didn't throw something, you raised your hand, that works.
I didn't interrupt you, did I?
Oh no, you're good.
Speaking about conflict and vocabulary, we used to use the word DEI a lot, and sometimes it almost feels like a Coca-Cola ad from the 90s, like very polished, where you see every color and everything, like that makes you feel good, but there are words that are used like anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-colonialism, anti-patriarchy, that are uncomfortable words. And what importance do you attach to all these words in your work when you work with organizations and when you approach them about all these topics?
So I want to repeat the question real quick, just for LinkedIn. So the question, as I understand it, is how do we address sort of those charged words like anti-racism and anti-colonialism? I picked the hardest one to say, to repeat. How do we address those words in the workplace from a leadership standpoint? Is that what?
Yeah. Using the word DEI is more comfortable than using the word anti-racism.
Oh, okay.
So which one do you use when you work with organizations, and what importance do you attach to all these words?
I actually don't use those words, because this is why. People will say, well, we want people to be uncomfortable, and they need to be uncomfortable. And I went for a job. It was this high job as a chief diversity officer once. And when I went to the place, they said, well, we want to make white people uncomfortable. And I was just like, wait a minute, that don't make any sense. If I want you to stay in a conversation with me, and I want you to understand where it is that I'm coming from, I'm not gonna do that if I'm intentionally creating a space where you don't feel safe, that you walk out. There are some people who do this work will say things just to make people walk out. And this is where I come in differently, and this is why I was able to train the Air Force and Space Force and other government leaders, because this is how I understand. We communicate in different ways, right? The biggest misconception about communication is that comprehension occurred. If I am a diversity, equity, inclusion person, and I'm teaching, I'm coaching, and I'm speaking to you in a language that you don't understand, am I effective? I'm doing the opposite of what I'm teaching. Does that make sense? Because I have to understand where you are. If I come in and I say white privilege and the whole room shuts down, I'm not effective. But if I ask a question, who has influence? Who has access? Who's at the table to be able to determine what is important and what isn't? Does that make sense? So I look at it like this also in psychological safety. Who am I speaking with in this room? Is it important to burn a bridge or expose the bridge so we can walk back and forth across it? If I burn you, and this is why people are getting sick, taking sick days on diversity training day, because what it feels like, they walk away feeling shamed and blamed. That doesn't mean that we cannot tell the truth. It's just it's the approach and how we use it. If I came in and said, today we're talking about rape, everybody already get tense because that's a word that when I'm talking about, and if I say anti-racist and my whole room is white, right? Now, when I say racist, all of a sudden I'm seeing subconsciously KKK, I'm thinking the South, I'm thinking about all the things. Now look at my face, what's happening as I'm thinking about lynchings and I'm thinking about slavery. And now I'm saying another thing that you need to understand is that when we talk about, does that make sense? Now look at my face. Can you trust me when I'm looking at you like this? I want to build a relationship. So what I'm going to share is the truth. I use the history as content. Does that make sense? I use the history as context, not content. Because oftentimes people do that and they'll speak so much on the racism that they don't get a chance to talk about the practical ways to address it and change. And then people walk away either feeling guilty, oh my God, I'm so sorry. That's not, but they don't have the skills or the tools to make systemic change. So I have to think long game. So when I say this, I want to give an example. You can never emotion your way through logic, and you can never logic your way through emotions. 2,787 black people get killed by police in Washington State every year. Black lives matter. It's not fair. Now, that's emotions, right? I just communicated with emotions with that statement. I've just made that number up, by the way. And that I just communicated that with emotions. Now, a person who addresses with logic, that's a small sample size when we have 7 million people. If you disaggregate the gap, that sample size is not enough to truly say that there is truly, that there's an issue. What about the people who were justified, were killed with the use of force was necessary for public safety? That emotion says racist, right? Now, what if we learn to do the wise mind, not emotion mind, not the logic mind? How does the wise mind meet in the middle with communication? What if logic mind, do we automatically say logic mind was racist, or are they using facts and dots and things like that? That's just because of the culture. That's the communication style. Doesn't mean that it's not, that they're the enemy. So now, what if they met in the middle? This is what wise mind, I teach people how to communicate in a wise mind. So now wise mind says, so not just my logic, I'm gonna move a little bit over. And I'm gonna say, wow, I see that you're hurting. But how would we have this conversation in a broader context when we look at data? When data is looked at in this way, and this is considered not a large enough sample size, and these things are considered, but anyone losing their life in our community should be a concern for everyone. I didn't agree with, or I say Black Lives Matter is an organization, it is this. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about my experience and my lens. Did you just see that? I didn't agree with a whole lot of things, but I acknowledged the pain and the hurt. And I asked, what would it look like if we had this conversation? How do we respond to a person who sees it this way? And then the other person is not making an absolute really quick. They're like, I didn't think about that. But we focus so much on putting it all out at once that we're not looking at, are people able to comprehend what it is that I'm saying and walk away with an idea that I can start somewhere. I can do X, Y, and Z. There are strategies, and there are, don't get me wrong, there are, as a black woman in a C-suite, oh my goodness. I'm telling you, sometimes I say it's hard, it's exhausting being black all day. I'm serious, it's like, I'll say something, that's why you say, how do you know a person is being a butthole, right? Yeah. Based off of perception. Mm-hmm. I've come in and have not done anything, and a staff like, oh, she's just so intimidating. What? I didn't do anything. And when it's like, okay, what behaviors am I displaying that causes, you to feel intimidated? Well, nothing, it's just how your energy and how you come in. What? Because people are afraid of what's different. And we have to come to the place where we're able to meet in the middle with the wise mind and tell the truth. So I can say anti-racism, or I can say, because if you look at individualistic culture, I saw this thing, it was a list, this researcher came out, and it said white supremacy culture on one side, and then it said the culture of collectivist culture on the side. And I was just looking, it said people of color, and I looked, I said, wait a minute, that's individualistic culture and that's collectivist culture. We have an individualistic culture system when it comes to healthcare, right? You can only talk about your healthcare with you. Well, as a black woman, when I grew up, culturally, my mother, no matter how old I am, if my mother is cognitive enough to come in a doctor and say, how's my daughter? My mom can speak for me. Does that make sense? But some people don't understand that because the culture is different. So it's that is what we need to look at. What is the cultural lens in which someone is communicating? And then we could look at the data and say, hey, we have disparities. We do, we have disparities. And if we look closely, we'll see that there is almost a racial stratification. The same disparities, if you look at the data of disparities in healthcare, education, the justice system, it all looks the same. The old school transparencies, when they put the little light on it, the project on the wall, it looks the exact same in every system. But we fight about words instead of saying, okay, what we do benefits most, but what do we need to do to benefit all? But we'll fight about critical race theory instead of how do we put our kids together and talk about the tough issues and teach them conflict resolution so they can come together and come up with the solutions to the world's most complex problems. So they can be honest about who's being left out and how do we fix it. We're not judgment-free and solutions-focused. When you come to the table solutions-focused and I care about you and you care about me, or we say we're all the same. And I tell people like, no, we are all the same, but we're not all the same. So what do you mean? I said, when we look at things, we saw about the Ukraine. When the Ukrainian people needed help, what happened? The whole world was like, oh, let's help. And we saw how Ukrainian was treated when they came to America and all countries. But a lot of people didn't see that African Ukrainians were rejected at every country. Rejected in every country. But we didn't look out and say, hey, how can we help them? Does that make sense? When we see the people who came through from Haiti, they were met with horses and whips. And it was just like watching them, I'm like, wait a minute, what are we doing here? When we think about when people say, I don't matter or Black Lives Matter, it's not about like an organization like some people say. What it is saying, I don't see the same treatment between myself and people who look like me and people who look another way. What I'm saying is that when I look at stratification, people, the darker your skin tone, the less access you have. When we think subconsciously, you use black, and I ask, what do you think of when you first hear the word black? Subconsciously, evil, Halloween, demons, scary, fear. When we say white, what do we think? Subconsciously clean, pure, holy. These are just subconscious things that automatically come to our head. So when we say black people, there's no way that your brain completely disassociates that. Does that make sense? So like I said, we all have some form of bias, but we need to understand how we come together. With multiculturalism is what I love. How do we all get along in the same space? That's what we need to focus on.
All right, so we have 1 minute left.
Oh, wow.
I know, it went really fast. Did you have a question, Alan? I was just gonna do a call. We can stay longer, it's not like a rule. I get to make the rules. So ask your question and then we'll wind down.
At that point, the term, your title, diversity officer, what is it exactly?
Oh, my title and my job is Chief Human Resource Officer.
Okay.
But
okay. And I was talking to Alex about this. People have perceptions when they hear words. I don't have a degree in social work or diversity work. But I finished a book by Pat Lencioni, Five Dysfunctions of Team.
And they're all the same principles. Do you think, like you said before, when they're gonna have diversity training and people think of that, automatically they think, they're gonna think I'm a racist or whatever. Do you think taking some of those like diversity terms or away, because all these principles are the same. I grew up with the same exact principle, but they were biblical principles. They're all the same about trust and inclusion and allowing people to be able to feel open to say whatever they want, and not being rejected. Like I said, all these principles, your principles from your schooling, Pat Lencioni's principles, his theories, biblical, they're all the same. Do you think an approach without taking the word diversity out for people would be a better approach, or just your thoughts on it?
I think that we have some supercharged words, but we also have to be honest about the differences. So I don't think we should shut down the conversation because some people are treated differently. I don't know how many times people have default to angry black woman when I do my job with accountability. If I had $1 for every time, I'm afraid, and it's like, what? Where I'm at in my life, you think I'm gonna throw away my entire career for one situation? I've been stabbed, I've been like this.
But this is the hill you're gonna die on.
Right, no, that's not gonna happen. So I think we definitely need to have the conversations. We need to address what it is. Stop putting all these big words and titles on it and call it what it is. We talk about inclusivity and inclusion. What does that look like organizationally? What does it look like as an individual? So people often talk about awake to woke and woke to doing the work. We all have a part in this, what needs to happen, in building inclusive community. What does that look like? Our everyday actions. I'm not talking over people. When I see people apply for jobs and I see that there's a woman or another candidate in the pool that didn't apply for this position because they didn't think that they could, making that call back and say, hey, I noticed that you didn't apply, you applied for this position. Would you be interested? I noticed that your resume also aligned with some other positions that are higher in our organization. Would you consider being considered for this particular applicant pool? It's looking around that's saying that diversity and inclusion can't only happen by a person of color. Does that make sense? So it's like, I don't think we should shy away from, but we should be very careful in the language that we use because it will determine how accepted it is or isn't. Does that make sense? You can fight.
Right.
I think we're saying the same thing.
Talking about the content itself, using that and those examples within the talking about in a business setting, because a lot of times, you just said people, they call in sick on that day. But just getting them in the room, and then because it all means the same thing.
Right. Yeah. And again, that comes to communication. How are we communicating that the people can comprehend it? And I think that we need to stop thinking that just because we're a person of color or a person from that's LGBTQIA, that it's us against. Does that make it's a yes and? We are here and everyone is a protected class. And if we all have that lens, how do we ensure that every person feels like a protected class? It's not just sharing the stories of people who are underrepresented, it's also hearing from others' perspectives. People got mad at me, a few of them, but other people loved it. I did an exercise with a group from the Air Force and Space Force, and they came to Spokane to learn. And I had a panel of white men as allies. And I asked every group, they had, imagine each table having African American, Native American, all these, races and gender identities on the table. And we asked 3 questions. What do you want people to know about your group? What would you never like to see, hear, or experience again? And what can your friends and allies do? Each group stood up and they had to be in the role of those people. And it comes out, I was like, you're safe here, nobody's judging. And so they all shared out. And at the end, I said, I let the white men as allies answer the same questions. And guess what? Every single one of them didn't want to be stereotyped, didn't want to be considered, needed somebody to stand up for them too. And it was amazing what happened after that panel and everybody in the room hearing that we all go through the same things. Does that make sense? Not the same way, but similar things. And if we focused on a solution, not the little things that the words that are not aligned perfectly. Does that make sense? Because I hear people say, this group focuses on the written word. And they say, well, you're focusing on the spoken word. Exactly how it should be. So we're calling each other out instead of in about the same things. But this is a long game. We're not going to get there overnight, but it is work to do, and it starts with the truth. And the truth can be painful at first. It does. But then we have to come up with a plan together on how to change it. But I'm not going to do it well if I put you out and I say, not you, or I do a training to make you walk out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it actually, to be honest with you, hearing your tools and talking about how to do this actually sounds easier than you think it would be, right? Like creating a space, I really liked the safety, mattering, and belonging. If you create that, everybody wins, right? Like it's not, doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but I think we walk into this thinking it's going to be so hard and how do we do this? And if you do those things, everybody wins, right? Like everybody matters, and it just doesn't seem as complicated as maybe we make it out to be. But
because of fear.
Yeah.
It's fear, which is the underlying factor that prohibits us from moving forward. Fear of being called a racist. Mm-hmm. I've noticed a lot of my white friends, they're so afraid of being called a racist that they end up sounding racist. Like, no, don't say that. I love people of color. I've got a black friend and I got a black neighbor. I'm like, don't do it.
They've got like their list in their pocket. No, let me show you how.
If you know you're not a racist, then you don't have to go to that fear of being called a racist. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And if we're all honest, I came here and I'm listening to you, and I'm expecting that you're going to give me the respect. I'm not stereotyping you, and I'm asking that you don't stereotype me. I'm willing to have a conversation here if we're going to address this issue, but I'm not going to be called names. What I won't do is this. Mm-hmm. I'm not willing to do that. So it's how do we set those norms? When I talk about my experiences with racial discrimination, it may not be comfortable from others, but it's not to downplay. Well, Kitara, they're a good person. Yeah, to you.
Yeah.
But the experience is not the same for me. And sometimes, when we tell people document. When you see people documenting and they're sending you that email from 1992, remember on April 19, 2017, you said with the image of your email, it's just like, that's hurt. Mm-hmm. That's hurt. That's rejection. So you have people with physical pain in your organization and are operating out of fear and rejection, and it is causing people to literally be in the bottom portion of the brain. So they're fight, flight, freeze, appease, or disassociate. When I say appease, it's like, oh, no. Oh, you can say what you say about women jokes. I grew up with brothers. It's like, girl, you're hurting, Don't disassociate, from it. Or, oh no, racism doesn't exist. I don't do that. I'm going to be honest about it, but I'm going to do it in a way that you can come to the table, and I'm going to put out a bunch of tools. You pick up whatever place on the continuum you want to start. And then once we get there, then we can move other places. But people come out with the steak and potatoes, all these big words, not understanding that if we're that woke with all these words, what about people with low literacy levels? Mm-hmm. What about people who some of the words that we've created they can't be translated? So, and some of the words, I have a master's, I'm like, what is this, Zana, what? It's like, if I have to get a PhD, you're not making it to respond to you. You're not making it easy for me to be a part of the conversation. Does that make sense? Yeah. And if the words change so often, because I remember it was, people came up with BIPOC. How many people have heard that? Mm-hmm. Black, Indigenous, people of color. So it's like BIPOC. And I was like, well, I don't think we should do that, because that relationally just doesn't sound right. One, it centers Black and Indigenous, but what about everyone else? We just say people of color. Our Latinx communities are one of the largest minority populations, that and multi-ethnic people. So we can't just clump everybody into people of color. So before this, it was people of color were called people of color. And then it became BIPOC. And now they said, well, we can't use BIPOC unless you're specifically talking about Black and Indigenous people. So I said, okay. And talking about other people of color. So I said, well, I did the research, so what are we using now? And they said people of color. So then it was, everybody went with the preferred pronouns. And then it comes back, now the pronouns aren't preferred, they're just pronouns. And so it's like, who updated everybody on that?
Yeah.
We have to be realistic. We have to be real and honest with each other. It's a constant learning. We're never quite always there. And I think that's what hurts some people, because it's not quantifiable, like, you know, but if we can measure relationships. I can look at whether I spoke to you. I can look at who was missing from each meeting. I can look at who's been speaking. I can say how many people, you know what, I've only met with these 3 people. Every time I need a new idea, I go to these people because I've learned to trust these people. Mm-hmm. Have we stretched ourselves as leaders to trust someone else or to mentor someone else? I'm done personally hiring rock stars. Rock stars. We write job descriptions looking for a rock star candidate that can do this. And who do we typically hire? Men, when we use that word. When we say looking for a compassionate person who's full of kindness and this, and we typically, you can see the interview panel committees will hire women every time. So when we're looking for a person, when you get neutral with those job descriptions, you're going to start seeing some more balance in the type of candidates that you're getting. It's just words are subconsciously associated with certain things. So we just have to be, look at how we're going to approach this workplace thing. When we do, we look at the people that we do hire. Are they all the same type of people with the same background? Do they subconsciously kind of look like you? I'm successful. Oh, this person reminds me of me when I was younger. Well, who are you going to bring in if it reminded you when you were younger? You're going to hire a bunch of yous. So it's like
that sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah. So, but it happens. Yeah. It happens subconsciously, and we do it all the time. And it's just being aware of our biases and how do we check them. And are we pushing ourselves to be able to accept the unknown?
Okay, on that note, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So, round of applause for Kitara.